We've all heard the saying, to win the war, you have to take out the enemy's army. But that's not always so easy. And sometimes the very ground itself can be your enemy. Hello, everyone. I am here to tell you the story of Mud March, or the Great Swamp as it was also called. It occurred during the American Civil War in January 1863 when Union Major General Burnside attempted to capture the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia. But he found out that defeating an army is much easier than defeating Mother Nature. Let's talk about it. So after the Battle of Fredericksburg, which we talked about previously, General Burnside, who was the commanding general of the Army of the Potomac, wanted to try something different. Instead of attacking across the Rappahannock River head-on, he decided to cross farther up north at Port Royal and then march directly south towards Richmond. He thought that if he could get his army past the river and deep enough into Virginia, the Confederates would not be able to stop him because there were no strong defensive works along this route. But there was one major problem. Burnside did not know that it was the rainy season in Virginia. From January to January, the armies of the Potomac and Northern Virginia sat camped along opposite sides of the Rappahannock River, with neither side willing to risk another decisive engagement until they could get more men and supplies. During that time, the weather was unseasonably warm for mid-January, which caused the rivers and streams to swell. By January, the rising water had washed out many of the roads between the opposing lines, turning them into a thick, soupy mess. On the 19th, Burnside's chief engineer, Lieutenant Colonel M.Z. Barnes, headed out to find a place where his troops could successfully cross the Rappahannock. Barnes found two locations that appeared suitable, at Port Royal and at Hartwood Church. On the 20th, Burnside ordered his troops to begin moving toward those locations. However, by the time they arrived, the roads were so muddy that vehicles could not move. At first, soldiers could still march through the muck, but as the day wore on and the skies continued to drizzle, the mud sucked at their feet and made it impossible to go further. As one soldier put it, the road was so bad that it was with difficulty our artillery could pass through. We had to take off the hubs of our wagons and put on a pole so that we could haul them out. Our cavalry horses were taken out altogether. That night, the troops slept in the mud, hugging their horses for warmth. In the morning, the officers ordered their men to start forward again, but soon had to order them back to camp. In fact, some units tried to march back, but they just sank deeper into the mud and had to be dug out by other units. At this point, everyone understood that there was no way they were going to be able to push forward. While Burnside really wanted to get this offensive to work, he knew he had to pull back before his entire command was stuck in the mud like a giant meat pie. So on the 22nd, he ordered his troops back to their original camps. Not a single shot was fired during the entire affair. And fortunately, this was not a secret operation, and word quickly got out that Burnside had failed to achieve his objective. So now, in addition to having wasted time and resources, Burnside had given Confederate President Jefferson Davis exactly what he needed to bolster Confederate morale, which was low following their victory at Fredericksburg. Davis traveled to Richmond to personally inspect the city's defenses, believing that an attack was imminent. He found the city undefended and unprepared. So he returned to his hotel room and wrote a letter to General Robert E. Lee, praising him for his victory at Fredericksburg and expressing his confidence in Lee's ability to repulse the coming attack. General Lee, however, was not so confident. Knowing that his army was smaller than Burnside's, he realized that he could not risk a battle in which his forces would be deployed in front of strong defensive works. As a result, he ordered his troops to dig a series of defensive trenches and redoubts facing the Union Army, creating what became known as the Winter Line of Defenses. These fortifications stretched from near the village of Hartwood Church all the way down to the Pamunkey River, covering a distance of 28 miles. But even though Burnside's plan had failed, there was a bright spot. You see, the main reason that Burnside wanted to get around the Confederate right flank and strike at Richmond was that he believed that Confederate President Jefferson Davis and most of the Confederate Congress would be in the city at that time. If he could capture Richmond, he reasoned, he would capture the Confederacy's leadership and perhaps even end the war. Although he failed to do that, this time, he gained valuable intelligence that would help him later in the year. After the mud, rain and misery of the march, Burnside's reputation as an effective general was done. His inability to get his troops beyond their starting point showed that he lacked the tactical skills necessary to lead the Army of the Potomac. While he had been successful in the western theater of the war, winning important victories at the battles of Middle Creek, Stones River and at the siege of Vicksburg, he'd made costly mistakes at Fredericksburg and now at the swamp. Even before the Mud March, Secretary of War Simon Cameron had been urging President Abraham Lincoln to replace Burnside with someone else. Following the Mud March, he wrote to Lincoln again, calling Burnside unfit for his position, writing, "I never saw an officer in a responsible station so generally disliked by his whole command. There are men in the cabinet who wish to make political capital out of the war by sacrificing the army. General Burnside is not one of these. His heart is in the right place, but he is deficient in the qualities of a great commander." Meanwhile, General Joseph Hooker had been recuperating from wounds suffered at the Battle of Fredericksburg, but was eager to return to duty. He wanted to lead the Army of the Potomac, and he let everyone know it. In fact, many people, including General Burnside, felt that Hooker was angling for the job. Lincoln, however, did not want to make a change. He had full confidence in Burnside and refused to relieve him of his command. But Lincoln would not be able to hold on to Burnside for long. On January, Burnside submitted his resignation, citing health reasons, but it was obvious to everyone that he was being forced out. Lincoln immediately accepted Burnside's resignation and appointed him to the post of Commissioner of the Freedmen's Bureau, an organization created to assist former slaves in transitioning to life after slavery. Joseph Hooker was made commander of the Army of the Potomac. On February, he led the troops in what became known as the Battle of Chancellorsville. But that's a video for another day. As for the aftermath of the Mud March, it wasn't long before it was forgotten. Other than some local residents in Virginia, no one even remembers that it happened. But sometimes it's important to remember the little-known stories like the Mud March. Because sometimes it's not only the big events that teach us the lessons we need to learn, but sometimes it's the small ones, too. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe and leave me a comment to let me know what you think. Thanks for watching. Today we're off to Britain in 1907 for the Mud March, a huge but ultimately unsuccessful demonstration for British women's suffrage. So let's get into it. February 1907 dawned cold and wet in London. A stiff wind blew across Hyde Park where a large crowd had gathered, sheltering under their umbrellas while they waited for the main event, a demonstration for women's suffrage. Now, this was no ordinary protest. Organized by the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, or the NUWSS, this was planned to be the biggest display of female solidarity for the cause yet. By 2 p.m., the crowd had swelled to over 3,000 women who were set to march through central London to Parliament in a show of unity and strength. This included members of the middle class who were generally more a part of the NUS and working-class women, who tended to join the more militant women's social and political union. The fact that these two groups could unite here today was in itself a huge deal. Working-class women often couldn't afford the time or the money to attend rallies like this, but were drawn to the possibility of achieving real change for their lives. The plans for the march had been in the works for months. Participants came from all over Britain, many paying their own way to be there. And when they arrived, they were given armbands to ensure that they knew fellow suffragists. These bands were meant to be simple black and white, but some people reported seeing purple ones as well. To show that they were prepared, one woman even wrote a whole song about it, complete with music so that everyone could sing along. When all was ready, Emmeline Pethick Lawrence, chair of the NUWSS, mounted a carriage with 2 other speakers, and they were pulled through the streets by a team of horses. From there, she addressed the crowd, outlining their demands for the right to vote and declaring that they would not rest until they were free. The crowd cheered, then broke into 3 columns and began their march. The plan was to head up the Strand, past Parliament, and then end at the King's Cross station. While the streets were packed with curious onlookers, the women kept a steady pace and good order. Most importantly, this was intended to be a peaceful and respectable demonstration, something that the upper classes could not fault. After all, this was the group that lobbied for their ideas to be heard through respectable channels and saw the more militant tactics of the WSPU as counterproductive. So far, they'd succeeded. But their path was soon turned to mud. Rain fell steadily, turning the streets into a thick, sucking sludge that clung to the women's boots and soaked through their clothes. Still, they pressed on. Despite the terrible weather, spirits remained high and several men joined the march, though it seems that they were told to keep a low profile. One man, Arthur J. Cook, later recalled that he and his friend had to hide their political badges under their coats. He also remembered the atmosphere of the day, saying, "We walked side by side with the women, shoulder to shoulder, singing songs and cheering. We were like an army on the march." And indeed, despite the downpour, the crowds grew as they went, with many joining in to show their support. By the time they reached Parliament, their numbers had swollen to between 6,000 and 8,000. Here, they listened to speeches from the carriage while standing knee-deep in water. Then they were on their way again, passing the Houses of Parliament at around 4:30 p.m. As the procession moved on, the rain continued to fall, soaking everyone to the bone. Many of the women were now knee-deep in water, which only grew deeper as they approached the last part of their route. As they trudged along, the wind whipping their hair around their faces, their banners snapped above them, proclaiming messages of equality and demanding votes for women. But the dreadful conditions took their toll, and soon the once orderly march became a disorganized mass of humanity slipping and sliding in the mud. Eventually, the crowds began to thin as people headed home, leaving the leaders and a few diehards to complete the route. When they finally arrived at the station, exhausted, muddy and dripping, they found that the trains had stopped running. There was nothing to do but trudge home through the deepening gloom. In the end, the Mud March, as it was later dubbed, was one of the largest public demonstrations ever seen in Britain up to that point. And its scale shocked even the hostile newspapers. Though their predictions that the miserable weather would dampen the women's spirits had been proven wrong, the same could not be said for their prediction that the march would have little effect. In fact, it did have an immediate impact. The Liberal government introduced a suffrage bill, but it did not go as far as was hoped and only passed in 1911, not at all what the suffragists wanted. For many, the Mud March was the beginning of their activism. And after this day, thousands more joined the fight for women's suffrage. The determination shown by these women should not be underestimated. They faced ridicule, abuse, and violence for their beliefs, yet they persisted. Despite the setbacks, events like the Mud March helped pave the way for future generations of activists and the hard-won battles that eventually led to the Representation of the People Act of 1918, which gave some women the right to vote. However, it's important to remember that even after this, the fight for equal rights and representation continued for decades. Full voting rights for women in Britain did not come until 1928 with the Equal Franchise Act. In the meantime, the legacy of those who fought for the right to vote lives on in the annual Women's Equality Day celebrated in the United Kingdom on February. The Mud March specifically has become something of a feminist London legend, demonstrating the grit and determination of those early 20th century suffragists. However, it is worth noting that this is just one of many such marches and events that took place during the suffrage movement both here and around the world. So if you want to hear more about this topic, check out our series on the history of women's suffrage. You can find the first episode linked below. Suffrage movements cropped up all over the world. In France, for example, the Mud March inspired a similar demonstration in Paris, though it was far more radical. If you've ever wondered what women's suffrage has to do with World War I, then that's the video for you. Just click here. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you learned something new. If you did, please do hit that like button. Also, why not get your name in lights like this lovely lot? Sign up to support us at a website. Special thanks to our top-tier supporters. If you'd like to see your name here and contribute to making videos like this possible, then you too can sign up at the link below. Today, we're going to talk about 2 different mud marches. There's not that many of them, so it shouldn't be too hard to cover both of them in the time that we have. The first one happened in 1862 in the American Civil War, and the second one happened in 1913 during the women's suffrage movement in the United Kingdom. The first mud march was actually called the Retreat from Mud. It took place in January of 1862, during the winter following the Battle of Antietam. By September of 1861, the Union Army of the Potomac had advanced into southern Maryland and established a base at the town of Point Lookout. The plan was to hold this base over the winter and then resume operations in the spring. But President Abraham Lincoln wanted something more. He wanted General George B. McClellan to push south and capture the Confederate capital of Richmond. And McClellan really didn't want to do that. He thought that his army wasn't ready for such a mission, and he also feared being trapped in a winter campaign. So the Union forces spent the day of the 23rd building siege works around the town while Confederate forces watched from the other side. On the 24th, the Union Army tried again. This time they managed to cross the river and take up positions near the village of Hartwood Church. Again, though, they found themselves under fire from Confederate forces who were dug into earthworks. Once again, the Union Army spent the night constructing siege works. By the next morning, things started to go wrong. A heavy rain poured down overnight and turned the ground into thick, sticky mud. When the Union troops tried to march off, they quickly became stuck. Also, supplies and ammunition were starting to run low, so it was decided that the army would march back to their starting point at Point Lookout. After 3 days of marching through the mud, the Union Army finally arrived back at their starting point on the 28th. In total, they had marched 50 miles and covered only 10. They lost about 250 men to the elements, disease, and exhaustion, but none to enemy fire. The retreat from Fredericksburg demonstrated how much manpower and resources were required just to sustain an army in the field, and it showed how difficult campaigning in the winter could be. It's considered to be one of the worst logistical blunders of the war. The Mud March of 1913 is considered to be one of the most important events in the British women's suffrage movement. The struggle for voting rights for women had been ongoing for decades, and there have been several acts of civil disobedience, including the throwing of stones and the burning of churches and public buildings, but these acts of violence weren't very popular with the general public. Suffragists knew they needed to do something more to draw attention to their cause. They planned a march from London to the House of Commons in Edinburgh. Along the route, they would stop at various towns and cities to speak at public meetings and hopefully win new supporters to their cause. The march began on October 31, 1913, with about 200 women and 40 men setting out from London. Within a few days, the group had swollen to over 800 people, including men, women, and children. Many of them slept in the open or in tents, and some walked barefoot the entire way. Others hitched rides on carts or trucks or even rode in the back of a friend's car. Along the way, they sang songs and shouted slogans like "Votes for Women." They faced hostility from some townspeople who didn't support their cause, but they were always outnumbered by the many people who came out to show their support. On November 5th, the marchers arrived in Edinburgh and began their demonstration outside the House of Commons. They were met by a large crowd of onlookers, as well as police who were there to keep the peace. The marchers stood silently for several minutes while their leaders addressed the crowd. Then they began to march around the building, singing songs and chanting slogans. As they marched, the police grew increasingly agitated and began to push the marchers toward the street. The marchers refused to move, so the police began to arrest them. In total, 143 marchers were arrested that day. The Edinburgh Seven were the first of the marchers to go on trial for their actions. Their trial began on December 12, 1913. They were charged with willfully obstructing the police in the execution of their duty. The defense argued that the marchers had not obstructed the police, but were merely exercising their right to peaceful protest. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning a verdict of guilty. The judge sentenced each of the 7 to 2 months in prison. Other trials followed, and in total, 98 suffragists were sent to prison. The 1913 Mud March had a profound impact on the women's suffrage movement. It raised the profile of the issue and put pressure on the government to take action. On November 18, 1913, the Prime Minister announced that the government was considering the issue of women's suffrage. And on February 2, 1917, the Representation of the People Act was passed, which granted voting rights to women over the age of 30 who met certain property qualifications. While this was not the full suffrage that the suffragists had been fighting for, it was an important step forward. And the Mud March of 1913 is now seen as one of the key events in the struggle for women's suffrage in the United Kingdom. Both the American Civil War and the women's suffrage movement were long and complicated. If you want to learn more about either of them, check out the links below. It's easy to think of big historical events as having been caused by a single factor. For example, World War I is often said to have been caused by the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. While the assassination was an important event, historians today understand that it was not the only or even the primary cause of the war. Instead, it was the result of a complex interplay of economic, political, and social factors. Thanks for watching. If you want to talk about the worst days in military history, then look no further than the Civil War Mud March of 1863. What started as an ambitious Union offensive to capture the Confederate capital of Richmond ended up being a disaster for the Union Army and led directly to the removal of one of its top generals. So let's talk about what went wrong. It's me. And this is a tale of two armies, two very different armies moving toward the same destination. The first was the Union Army of the Potomac, 160,000 strong under the overall command of General George Mecklemore, who had recently taken over from General Scott. And the second was the smaller Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, 78,000 strong under the command of General Robert E. Lee. Now, Mecklemore wanted to get to Richmond, but he didn't have a clear plan on how to do it. At the beginning of 1863, the Union Army was spread out along a front that stretched from the south of the James River all the way up towards the Potomac. There was just no way they were going to cross the James at Richmond or take the city by frontal assault. And so Mecklemore decided to send his subordinate, Major General Burnside, to probe for weakness in the Confederate lines and find a way to advance closer to the city. This is where our story begins. On May, Burnside began his advance with 40,000 troops, intending to get behind the Confederate right flank and threaten their communications with Richmond. Burnside planned to move quickly and cover 25 miles down the peninsula in 3 days. He intended to use the railroads to resupply his troops as they moved south. But unfortunately, he neglected to consider the weather. The weather, you see, was bad. It rained heavily every day from the start of the march and turned the roads into thick, sucking mud. And then soon after, it just got worse. Day after day, Burnside's army struggled to trudge through the mud, losing all hope of reaching their daily objectives. By May 9th, only 15,000 men had made it that far. But Burnside decided to press on. And despite the terrible conditions, sent his chief engineer to find a way across a particularly nasty stretch of mud near Newmarket. But before he got back with a solution, Burnside got word that a Confederate force was marching toward him, and he panicked. You see, Burnside was already shaken. His army was exhausted and demoralized, his supply situation was dire, and his objective had slipped away. Now he feared being attacked by the Confederates and crushed. And so he ordered his entire force to retreat. In fact, things were so bad that when Burnside attempted to rally his troops, many of them literally could not move. They were stuck in the mud up to their waists and some were stuck in the mud up to their armpits. So what should have been a fighting retreat quickly turned into a rout. By the end of the 10th, 12,000 troops were still stuck in the mud while another 12,000 straggled back to their starting point. Only 16,000 actually made it back to their original positions. Now, to be fair, Burnside wasn't entirely at fault. This was, after all, the spring in Virginia. And mud season in Virginia is something that even the locals will tell you to avoid. But there's also evidence that the weather may have been less bad than Burnside thought it was. In fact, recent analysis suggests that it likely wasn't raining heavily at all on most of the march. Instead, it seems like the real problem was that the area was experiencing an early spring thaw. All the snow from the winter had melted and turned the ground to liquid mud. But whether or not Burnside was justified in his belief that it was too dangerous to wait out the weather, there is one thing that we can all agree on. The Union Army was in big trouble. Their attempt to turn the tide of the war had failed. Their biggest general was missing. And now they had to return to their old positions while Lee's army was free to move north. And that's because Burnside had neglected to secure the railroads that he was depending on to supply his army. And when the bulk of his forces were forced to stop and wait, those supply lines dried up, and his army became incredibly short on food and ammunition. In fact, the soldiers ran out of both so quickly that many of them were forced to forage for food and scavenge for ammunition. It was such a serious problem that Brigadier General Charles Marshall, Chief of Artillery for the Army of Northern Virginia, later reported that he saw Union soldiers in the woods near Fredericksburg carrying off captured Confederate artillery pieces. "I noticed," he said, "that they did not take off the iron hoops from the caissons, but cut them open with knives and took out the powder to carry off. And it wasn't just a lack of supplies. It was a lack of everything." When the time came to retreat, many of Burnside's soldiers were too exhausted to walk. Medical facilities were overwhelmed with tired, hungry soldiers. At one point, doctors at the field hospital near Falmouth recorded that they had received 211 patients who were suffering from exhaustion, 126 cases of acute bronchitis, 20 cases of pneumonia, 14 cases of heart disease, and 1 case of insanity. It was a humiliating defeat for the Union Army. And the only reason Lee didn't press his attack was because he was low on ammunition himself. But for Washington, it was unacceptable. And they needed someone to blame, someone other than themselves. So they found the perfect scapegoat in Major General Burnside. You see, Burnside had been considered a hero since 1859 when he led the effort to rescue captured anti-slavery activists from a jail in Lecompton, Kansas. His long, flowing whiskers became a symbol of the Union cause. And politicians in Washington loved him. He was a man of the people, and his mere presence boosted Union morale at home. In fact, Washington was so fond of Burnside that they promoted him above more qualified officers and gave him key commands at some of the most important battles of the war, including the Second Battle of Bull Run, the Battle of Chancellorsville, and the Siege of Fredericksburg. But he never lived up to the expectations of his civilian bosses. He refused to take orders from the politicians. He ignored the advice of his superior officers, and he made one tactical blunder after another. He lost the Second Battle of Bull Run badly. He alienated General Hooker by taking over command at Chancellorsville. He failed to secure critical crossroads at the start of the Gettysburg campaign. He allowed Confederate forces to escape from Fredericksburg, and now he had routed his own army in a catastrophic defeat. There was just no excuse left. Washington relieved him of duty and sent him home in disgrace. But they knew that if they were going to win the war, they had to find another general, someone better than Burnside but not so problematic. So they reached out to a man named General Joseph Hooker. To learn more about America's most humiliating defeat and the rise of the greatest general of the Civil War, please check out these videos. It is also worth noting that the American Civil War was one of the deadliest conflicts in world history. Over the course of 4 years, 620,000 Americans died in battle. That's why today we honor their sacrifice. And I would like to take a moment to thank our supporters whose names you can see on screen right now. Without your support, this channel would not be possible. If you would like to see your name on the screen and show the world your support for this channel, then join our membership program today. And finally, if you haven't already subscribed, please do so today. It's free. It helps out the channel and it ensures that you never miss a new video. Thanks for watching. See you next time.